Welcome aboard. This is the Admiral's Almanac, your leadership life connection, bringing leaders from all walks of life into yours so you can take charge, improve your leadership, and improve your life. With the wit and wisdom of your host, Rear Admiral Gary Hall.
And welcome to the Admiral's Almanac. I'm your host, Gary Hall, and I'm pleased today to have an old friend and mentor on the show. Please welcome Navy Captain George Galdorisi. George was an active duty naval officer and naval aviator for 30 years. A graduate of the United States Naval Academy, George served with distinction. Every day he wore the cloth of our nation and our Navy. A true leader in the air, at sea, on staff, and ashore, he has always blended physical and moral courage along with intellectual leadership. George is a thought leader, strategic thinker, and a New York Times best-selling author. And he just published his 15th book, all through major publishers. Welcome aboard, George Galdorisi. Good afternoon. How are you today?
Hey, Gary. Thanks so much for having me on this show, and it's great to catch up with you across the miles. We need to get you back here to San Diego now that the I-bar is open again, and we can tip a few and tell lies. But appreciate you having me on the show.
Oh, absolutely. And before we talk about your newest thriller, Fire and Ice, I'd like to go back a bit because sometimes our listeners want to know, how did you start? What prompted you to go to the Naval Academy back in the years you went? Because I think if I remember, right there in Bancroft Hall, they had those placards of classmates or graduates that had been killed in Vietnam. So what made you go to the Naval Academy?
Yeah, no, Gary, it's a great question, and thanks for asking it. So I grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn, actually. Was blessed to go to a great public high school, Brooklyn Tech. 6,000 guys, no girls back then. And we were the school that was what we call today STEM, science, technology, math, and hardcore subjects like that. And most people who graduated from our high school went to Caltech, Rensselaer, other engineering schools. You became an engineer and architect. You worked in a tall building in Manhattan for 65 years, got your gold watch, and that was it. And that just seemed a little program. So I went to the Naval Academy looking for adventure with no thoughts of making it a career. But once I got into it, all of a sudden, 30 years went by in a flash, and I enjoyed every minute of it, and probably do it all again, or would do it all again.
I'm 100% with you. I went for the adventure and also the opportunity, and then I've added over the years association with heroes. And I think today the young men and women that are joining as sailors, whether enlisted or officer, are looking for those same things, adventure and opportunity. I lauded your leadership in the introduction, and that was no fluff piece. For the final 14 years of your career, basically 50% of your career, you spent in command leadership positions. So that takes a lot of stress on you and the family. So you commanded 2 squadrons, 1 amphib ship, commodore of an amphibious squadron, and 5 years as chief of staff of an aircraft battle group. So talk a little bit about your leadership and how it evolved, from your first squadron.
No, well, thanks for that. I guess most of us who have any leadership qualities at all learned it from good leaders. And so I was just lucky to have good leaders. And I guess I paid attention to what they did well. And the few times there were not so good leaders, paid attention to what didn't work for them. And I think it all came down to, particularly as an aviator, remembering that all the maintenance folks, the wrench turners, the people who fix the engines and the rotor blades and the airframes, they were there so you could do the profession you loved. So, as a division officer, I always reminded myself that these fellows, they're all fellows back then in the early 70s, made it possible for me to do what I love doing. So that made the leadership piece pretty easy, that you appreciated what they did.
Yeah. So, that's 14 years of leadership positions. And for folks, the 2 squadrons, first you commanded an operational SH-60 Bravo squadron. Now they're Romeo squadrons. And you were instrumental in bringing that aircraft on board. And so talk a little bit about that being the cutting edge of the H-60 Lamps Mark III community.
Sure. Well, LAMPS as a program, and LAMP stands for Light Airborne Multipurpose System. And for your listeners that might not have Navy background, the whole LAMPS community was created because the only helicopters in the fleet back in the 60s and early 70s were on aircraft carriers, and we wanted to spread out that ability to frigates and destroyers and cruisers. So we came up with LAMPS Mark I program, which was a H-2 helicopter that had seen service in Vietnam, pretty old aircraft. We realized, the Navy, that wasn't the be-all and end-all, so the LAMPS Mark III program was created, and basically it was envisioned as a P-3 aircraft where you cut off the front and put it up in the air, and took all the sensor operators in the back and put them on the ship. And that was the concept. It was an elegant concept, and it worked. It worked tremendously well.
Yeah, you're being humble. The fact that you were in the first squadron, the Battle Cats that brought that on, and as we fast forward to the current time, the Naval Aviation is buying primarily F-18s and H-60 variants, the Romeo and the Sierra. So that took a lot of leadership to bring that on board. So as you went on, and you then became commanding officer of what was then the Fleet Replacement Squadron, HSL 41. And so you were leading not only that squadron, which was training maintainers, air crew, and pilots, but also you were the mentor, leader, and example for 4 or 5 other squadrons. So, how was that jump in leadership from squadron leadership to leading the FRS?
Yeah, the FRS, the replacement squadron, is different. It basically is a training squadron, and the trick there is you realize that you're training the next generation of not just pilots, but the next generation of commanding officers and wing commodores and even flag officers in several cases. So I think in that command tour, I paid a lot more attention to leadership by example, and tried to impart what I could to those officers. So they would want to become commanding officers, and not everyone does. And second is to be mindful of the example they set for their juniors.
Absolutely. And so from there, you jumped on to an amphibious ship, the LPD, and that must have been quite a change going from squadron command to command at sea.
Yeah, it was very different, as you might imagine, and I think it's worth noting, Gary, as you know from your time in the LAMPS Mark III community. I had the privilege of coming out to San Diego in 1983 to be a plank owner in HSL 41. New community, brand new aircraft, and most helicopter pilots wanted to join that community. So we had an embarrassment of riches of officers in both HSL 43 and HSL 41. So with that kind of talent, being commanding officer was pretty easy, because everyone was enormously talented. They knew what they were doing. They wanted to be there, and like I said, it was fairly easy. When I went to USS Cleveland, it was a standard Navy amphibious ship. We at that time in the Navy, most of the really high-powered talent was going to the Aegis community, Aegis cruisers and then destroyers. So honest engine, I felt more needed and useful on Cleveland. I'd be walking down the passageway and see a sailor welding without a mask on, and hey shipmate, let's talk about this, and make sure he was doing things that were safe, and again, very junior wardroom and crew. So it was a really busy tour. We did drug ops several times, went through the Panama Canal 4 times, and see some drugs in some drug busts. So it was a very rewarding tour.
Wow, fantastic. I do have to tell you that I was at the establishment ceremony when Mike O'Connor took command of HSL 41, and I was one of those junior lieutenants sitting in the folding chairs looking out at Mike O'Connor on the podium with Point Loma in the background, a little bit of that haze. Well, I'll tell you, just 3 weeks ago, I was there for a change of command, sitting in the same type of seats, looking out over Point Loma. And as the 2 Commodores were there, and the incoming commanding officer, outgoing commanding officer, and the XO were there, and I went, they're babies. How did we let these young babies command squadrons. And then as soon as they started speaking, they sounded just like us when we were in that position, when we thought we were the old man. But it's amazing responsibility given to young men and women, and in our community, those that excel at leadership. So then you were Commodore of an amphibious squadron, isn't that correct, after Cleveland?
Yeah, I was Amphibious Squadron 7, and during that time, we started out as a maintenance squadron. We had 14 ships, including some very old amphibious ships like LKAs and LSTs. And our job was to man, train, and equip, make sure those ships were ready to deploy with an amphibious ready group. And then midway through my tenure, we transitioned to be an assault squadron, meaning we were the ones who deployed with 3 or 4 ships in an amphibious ready group. We call them expeditionary strike groups now. So again, it wasn't the fanciest part of the Navy, but as opposed to, let's say, the LAMPS community where we did anti-submarine warfare and you're tracking a submarine and you're not really sure whether the submarine's there or not, but you're doing what you're doing. As you know from your experience in commanding officer tour, Gary, in the amphibs, you see stuff happening every day. The helo lands on the ship. You put a stick of Marines in there, and they head towards the beach. And at the end of the day, you could kind of chalk it up to all the things you'd accomplished that day, which are pretty awesome.
Absolutely. I remember a cruiser flag officer came on board my amphib and was amazed at the complexity, even for more complexity than an Aegis ship. So you then spent 5 years as chief of staff of an aircraft carrier strike group, and that's a change in leadership. You've gone from tactical to operational, and you're not only just leading down, but as the chief of staff, you're leading up. Did you find that as a challenge, that you're actually, as the chief of staff, leading the admiral as well? Well,
yeah, you're leading up, down, and sideways. And I think up is, and again, not to get misty-eyed about it, I was privileged to serve for 5 exceptional flag officers, 3 who went on to 3 stars, and they were all great leaders, and so I learned a lot from them. But I think that the biggest challenge in a carrier strike group is you've got some very strong leaders, the CO of the aircraft carrier, the carrier air wing commander, the destroyer squadron commander, Aegis ship commander, and they've all made their way in the Navy, figuring out how to do it right and how to do it their way. Well, when you bring them all together in a strike group, we can't do it everyone's way. We have to do it the admiral's way. So, my role was mainly as a negotiator. Say, well, skipper, CAG, I can see why you want to do it that way, but these are the admiral's desires, and we're going to do it this way. And it never came to a knockdown, drag out, but it came to a lot of negotiating and people compromising, quite frankly. So probably learn more about leadership in that tour, because it wasn't top-down directional positional authority. It was, let's figure out a way to make this work kind of leadership.
Absolutely. I always described your position there as like a hydraulic system. You either amplified or dampened a signal, whether you needed to dampen going down or dampen going up or amplify. So that was 14 years in command positions. Did you see yourself, now looking back, evolve? What changed, but then what stayed the same?
So we've known each other a long time, so I'll be completely honest with you. In the Navy, it's anathema to say anything but my worst day in command was better than my best day doing anything else. And I love my command tours. I had 4 of them. But if I could do one tour over again, it was chief of staff, because I didn't want to be the one standing on the flight deck putting a medal on Seaman Johnny Jones. But I wanted to be the one to make sure that he got written up for the award. That the award got awarded in front of his shipmates, that we sent, back when we used to mail pictures and envelopes, sent pictures home to his mom and dad and high school principal, et cetera, et cetera. So I found that role, I guess, to be more fulfilling than the command tours.
I can see why. Plus that broadened your knowledge of the Navy operations and joint operations all around. So simultaneous to this process of leadership, you began writing. Well, you began writing before you went into command. In fact, you started writing, your first article was published 8 years after graduating from the Naval Academy. What did it feel like to get your first article published in a professional journal?
So, it's kind of a rush to see your name in print. And I had commanding officers who encouraged me to write in professional journals because that was those were ways to help the profession and help people think about different ways of doing things. So it came kind of naturally. And once you publish one or two and have editors who are used to you and help you along the way and help you become a better writer, it just sort of was self-sustaining going along.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're writing exclusively at this point in these journal articles, nonfiction. Is that correct? Yeah,
they were all professional journals, so it was all nonfiction, short articles, typically between 2,000 and 3,000 words.
Now, even though it's nonfiction, still storytelling is important in that process, don't you think? What's your feeling on storytelling, even in nonfiction?
Yeah, well, there's an old saying that Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond series, once said that you have to want the reader to turn the page. So whether it's a 100,000 word novel or a nonfiction book or an article, you want them to keep reading. So that's kind of the art of it. And I'm not sure I ever took a course or learned specifically how to do it. It was mainly editors showing me how to do it better and being accepting of that help.
Absolutely. So writing, thinking, storytelling, did that shape your leadership?
Yeah, I think in some ways is that, life is a story. And I think the first thing that, sometimes people think of people who write as, these strange beings who are empowered with something special. And there's nothing special about writing. We've been doing it for 40,000 years. When Ugg went out of the cave to do battle with the saber-toothed tiger, he didn't go out and bring the tiger back to the cave and throw it on the floor and said, "Enjoy your meal." He told the story about it. And before we had language, the story was told on the cave walls, and those paintings, endure to this day. So, I think storytelling is, you always want to look ahead and help the reader wonder about what's happening next. So I think from a leadership perspective, and combining that with storytelling, it was sitting down with a junior officer or chief petty officer or sailor and said, well, if we do this, what will likely happen next? What will happen to you? What will happen to the command? And put it in a bit of a narrative rather than just sort of bullet points or black and white.
Right. Now, you keyed on something there that, as you said, you had no special training. And, I think people, when they see authors like yourself or my classmate Jim Stavridis, they go, how the heck do I get started? And so you basically said everybody should write. Don't you think, no matter whether you're an author, but everybody should be involved in storytelling and telling their own story and writing? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, again, thinking of storytelling is something that's very natural. And there's a famous saying, no one ever made a decision based on data. They need a story. And so it's a narrative. It's telling, why something happened, what's going to happen. Norman Palmer, who's one of the best naval nonfiction authors of all time, said, history is what the writers say it is, meaning someone has to write down what's happening, and that becomes history, becomes facts. So I think it all kind of kludges together.
Yeah, absolutely. So at some point, you've written hundreds, dare I say, thousands of articles, professional journals. You've won every stinking military writing award from every association. It would get to the point where, who gets the award this year? We gave it to George last year. So you've run all these awards. You've written all these articles. And I guess you would call that short form writing. So when did you switch from short form writing to what I would call long form?
So, Gary, there's an old saying, you make plans, but God laughs. I was real happy writing articles. And then I took a master's degree in international relations, took some courses in the law of the sea, which is a UN convention, which I think you know a lot about from your Navy days, and got very passionate about the fact that the U.S. should sign the law of the sea convention. So started writing articles in that vein. And then that graduated to 2 books on the law of the sea. So that was my first foray into nonfiction. And then other books that I did in nonfiction, I did one with a fellow class of 69 at the Academy, who I think you know, Tom Phillips. We did a book called Leave No Man Behind, which was a chronicle of combat search or rescue. But the nonfiction book I just thought your readers might, or your listeners might be the most interested in is, I think everyone recalls that Alfred Eisenstadt photo of the sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square. There it is, the kissing sailor. So why is that a book, and why is that a famous picture? So August 14th, 1945, there were rumblings that Japan may have surrendered. When you lived in New York City in 1945, there was no Twitter, no Facebook, no Instagram. So where do you go to learn the truth? You go to Times Square. And so the nurse, Greta Zimmer-Friedman, was there to read the ribbon in Times Square to find out the news. And George Mendonça, the sailor, was doing the same thing. There were things that happened in World War II where he had a very soft place in his heart for Navy nurses. So he rushed up and kissed her. Well, Alfred Eisenstadt never got the people's names. They didn't exchange phone numbers or anything. They went their separate ways. The picture became famous. Life magazine in 1980 said, you know, this is our most famous photo. We'd like to do a retrospective on the war. And 35 years ago, so will the sailor and nurse in this picture please raise your hand? Guess what happened?
Everybody rose their hand.
Everyone. And these people weren't charlatans, but, you know, there was a lot of liquor being poured that day, number one. Number two, memories fade. And all these people came forward saying, I'm the sailor, I'm the nurse. So my co-author and I proved who the sailor and the nurse were, simply so their children and their grandchildren could know who they were. So that was really a joyful project to undertake.
And for our listeners, it is a fantastic book, The Kissing Sailor. Highly recommended, and I think it's a wonderful story of history, nostalgia, and then the investigative process, and it's really well written, and I can't recommend it highly enough. We talked a little bit about writing is not easy, and everybody wants to be a writer, and few obtain your success. Even with that fact, shouldn't everybody write? We talked a little bit about that, but did you have mentors, and what are you doing? I believe you're giving back to the writing community.
Yeah, no, I had mentors when I worked, when I started writing articles. Mr. Fred Rainbow was the editor of Proceedings. And Fred was a wonderful, patient guy. And like I said, if you looked at some of the early things I wrote in Proceedings and the way they evolved to better articles, it was really all due to Fred. And then when I worked in industry, I worked for a gentleman, Dr. Scott Truver, who was a fabulous writer. He's probably published more articles in Proceedings than any other human. And he helped me with my writing, again, very in a positive way, in a good leadership way, not being critical, just saying, no, we need to say it this other way. So today I do writing seminars for folks. The last Naval Helicopter Association symposium, we did a writing workshop for young junior officers, so they could come in and kind of learn the tricks of the trade. And then I put some writing tips on my blog, on my website. Whenever I find something, an article where I go like, gosh, that's good information. I need to share that. I'll put it on the blog and then again, share it as widely as I can.
Well, I took a look at those tips and techniques over the past couple of days on your website, and I can't recommend them enough to anybody that wants to write anything. It's a great way to start. And like I said, a lot of people see us, okay, you're the old successful guy, how do I ever get there? Well, put pen to paper or pencil to paper. But your website is awesome, and I thank you for giving back to the writing community. Now let's shift gears to this latest thriller that you have just had published. But first I want to mention that this is a thriller series. So how did you go from the writings that you were doing to all of a sudden going, okay, I'm going to write some thrillers with a character named Rick Holden, and of course the lovely young Lieutenant Laura Peters. So how did you make that shift in genre? Yeah,
well, they say it was actually pretty easy. They say write what you know. So as we talked earlier, I Well, first of all, Gary, I'm from New York City, so I see a conspiracy everywhere. So in all my writing, there's some conspiracy in the background. So for my first Rick Holden book, The Coronado Conspiracy, I had done drug ops when I was in command at Cleveland, and I always wondered about what was going on and who was getting the money and stuff like that. And so I came up with a story where the senior military officers were very unhappy with the president. They wanted to see him impeached. I know this is total fantasy in today's environment, but roll with it for a second. And so they concocted a military operation that he supported and he put his own general in charge of, and they caused it to fail. And many soldiers were killed. And then they tried to use that to impeach him. And of course, Rick Holden and Laura Peters found out about it. And it was their goal to try to get to Congress before the impeachment. So that's how the story evolved. But again, it was what I knew. It was drug ops. The locations in Panama and Colombia and other places were real, and places I'd been. So it was easy to write. And then fast forward to the next book, For Duty and Honor. It's a carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf. Iran is doing things to the United States, killing American citizens, and the nation's not doing anything. And so the carrier strike group commander decides to take matters into his own hand. If you think of it, it's Heart of Darkness on an aircraft carrier. Take things into his own hands and start his own war with Iran. And again, Rick Holden and a different person have to stop that. And then Fire and Ice, the latest one, was really the one I more of a stretch for me, because it's not as much of a naval novel as it is a military novel. It takes place in Europe, and it involves Russia putting pressure on one country. And in Eastern Europe, Belarus, it has Russia strangling energy supplies to Europe. It has Russia blocking the Suez Canal with a ship that they sink. It has mines in the Suez Canal. So I wrote that several years ago, and it's nice to see that some of those things are coming to pass today. So that's this genre we call Thinkent now. Then you mentioned Jim Stavridis. He's probably one of the best writers in that genre with his book 2034. Others have done the same thing, and so that's where Fire and Ice is. It's using real world military operations and intelligence to come up with the story that's not fantasy, but could really happen.
Oh, absolutely. And Jim Stavridis talks about writing fiction in order to get people to think. And I think Fire and Ice really does make you think, and it grabs you right away with a brutal death in a St. Peter's Square during a student protest. It grabs you right away. And I think it really highlights what we're dealing with Russia and with Putin and the brutalness of that regime and that country. And I remember I wrote a piece for a conservative website called Putin is a Bully. And he still is KGB. You can name it anything else you want, but he is KGB, wants to maintain power. And when Joe Dunford and I were in Moscow and meeting with politicians there, they said they would no longer let the Ukraine go than we would let Texas go. Well, I don't know how that's going to play out, but there is rumblings in Texas here of becoming our own country. Yeah. But I think it really highlights what's going on over there and should make people think. And that's why, I mean, they're all wonderful thrillers, but this latest one, Fire and Ice, I think is really relevant to today, especially with the fact that we've had meat processing plants hacked, the oil pipeline hacked, which affected all us citizens right in our wallet right away. And so the United States tends to obey international laws. China and Russia do not. So I think Fire and Ice should be commended to any strategic thinkers, war planners, politicians, to think what we're dealing with Putin and Russia. So, I mean, do you concur with my assessment of your book?
Yeah, no, like I said, it's nice to see the things you're leaning into. gaining traction and purchase. And I guess the other thing, just very briefly on FICINT, it wasn't that long ago where people who worked in the Pentagon and the national security field and fields you're very familiar with from your time in Washington, they didn't want to hear from people outside the Pentagon. They thought they had all the answers. And more recently, the military has been embracing fiction as ways to try to see the future of warfare. The Army Training and Doctrine Command, Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, Naval War College, Army War College, many think tanks all sponsor fiction writing contests to draw out those ideas that you don't necessarily find coming out of the walls of the Pentagon. Doesn't mean the people there aren't smart, but they have their job to do, and they're not paid to be thinking outside the box that way.
Absolutely. Now, will we hear more about Rick Holden and Laura Peters here in the future?
Well, yeah, there's always a sequel. I'm working on that one now. And for any of your listeners that read any of the Rick Holden thrillers, there's easy ways to reach me via my website. And I'd love to hear reader feedback for like this, didn't like that. So I am working on the next thriller. And without giving it all away, it involves the U.S. and China. What a surprise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been to China while I was on active duty a couple times, and I don't think they'll ever recall all our debt at one time. And they say the United States understands us more than anybody else because they're a continental nation. And what's interesting is the Chinese people act very much like Americans. I mean, the way they dress and the way they move and interact. I was at a restaurant and saw a table with 8 women, and I said, "Those are my wife's aunts." The way they interacted, the way they talked, and the way they joked. What was also interesting was they get to a certain age and they get to pick an American Western name, and so it was interesting to see my mother's name from 1918, Ethel, being used by a waitress in a 5-star hotel. Anyway, I digress. And so your background in the military, I mean, Holden, the CIA, Navy, so that's not based on me, right? That's he's a little bit more studly.
Well, it could be.
Could be. Anyway, so your intellectual background, your military background has produced a tremendous body of work to have 15 books published. And as I may have mentioned to you, the Rick Holden series also reminded me of William F. Buckley, who was an intellectual like yourself, who then wrote a Blackford Oates series of spy novels that I got hooked on when I was a lieutenant. So is there anything you want to leave our listeners with? I know we will promote your website, georgegaldorisi.com. And if you're an aspiring writer, there's great tips. He's got all his PowerPoint slides on there, great articles, a very professional blog, both in presentation and in content. So I applaud you for that. So what are your final thoughts on leadership, on writing, and about the state of affairs today?
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Gary. I think, if it's come across in the last 45 minutes, I really do encourage people, particularly people at the beginning of their career, whether it's Navy lieutenants or lawyers or doctors, to write. And, it wasn't that many years ago where the bar was really high. You had to go to one of the big 5 publishers. You had to go to a major magazine like Time or Life. And, that's a lot of competition with a lot of people. Now there's so many different venues for people to express their views in a thoughtful way. I'll give you one small example. In our Navy helicopter community, we have our quarterly publication, Rotor Review, and that's been around for decades and decades. The latest issue of Rotor Review is probably twice as thick as it was 5 years ago, with so many articles by so many junior officers who really care about their profession and write about it in a thoughtful way. So I think that encourages me that we're bringing all these good ideas forward from the people who haven't been burdened with all the baggage some older people carry. They're young and they're enthusiastic and they want to write.
Absolutely. So you can get your book, Fire and Ice, from Amazon.com, and the audio book is also on Audible. Is there any other places where you can get the audio book?
Amazon is my mainstream place where all these books are found. So, like I said, if someone were to just Google my name, that would pull up my website, and depending on what book they're interested in, it'll take them right to Amazon. So pretty easy breezy.
Super. Well, I want to thank you for years of mentorship and your leadership by example, not only as a naval officer, but as a husband and father. You've set a great example, you and your wife, Miss Becky, and you've influenced a lot of people, more people than you think you know that you've influenced. And so, as somebody once said, it's easy to count the seeds in an apple, but only God can count the apples in a seed. And you've planted plenty of seeds, and so millions of apples have grown from that. And hopefully this will help encourage other young men and women to put pen to paper and start writing something longer than a tweet or an Instagram post.
There you go. Okay, Gary. Well, thanks again for having me on your broadcast, and I've enjoyed connecting with your listeners, and hopefully we can do it again downstream sometime.
Absolutely. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Admiral's Almanac with our guest, New York Times bestselling author, Captain George Galdorisi. His latest book, Fire and Ice, is a real page-turner, and it's available at Amazon.com. Also, be sure to check out his website for writing tips and insights on national security at georgegaldorisi.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the Admiral's Almanac wherever you get your podcasts. Until we meet again, here's wishing you a happy voyage home.